Hi, I'm Craig Smith, a former New York Times correspondent and host of the podcast Eye on AI. I'm also a special government employee at the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And in this role, I'm serving as the host for NSCAI's podcast series on the Commission's work. At the beginning of March this year, the Commission issued its final report to the President and Congress, outlining its recommended strategy for winning in the artificial intelligence era. This week, I speak to NSCAI staff Tess Deblanc-Knowles and Mike Garris about the steps the U.S. government needs to take to foster AI innovation in the years ahead. I hope you find the conversation as important as I did. Could I have you guys start by each introducing yourselves, and then we'll talk about some of the recommendations on setting the conditions for AI innovation?
Sure. I'm Tess Deblanc-Knowles. I'm one of the full-time staff of the Commission. I've been on the Commission since we got off the ground in April of 2019, and I've been leading our effort focused on AI research and development, really looking to answer the question of how we can maintain U.S. leadership in AI research and development, both broadly and then specifically for national security purposes. Pass it over to Mike.
I'm Michael Garris. I am a computer scientist from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I'm on detail to the Commission as the Chief Technology Advisor, and I have been a part of the Commission. I joined a month after Tess in May of 2019, and I have really fortunate to serve as an advisor, so this has given me an opportunity to contribute in a number of different ways, including the topic we'll be talking about today with innovation in defense. And the things that I have particularly focused on would be digital infrastructure and data and test and evaluation.
Can we start by having you guys characterize the state of AI R&D in the U.S. today, and that would be both defense and non-defense R&D?
So to start out, it's really important to provide the lens through which the Commission viewed this issue, and essentially through the understanding that U.S. global leadership and national security is firmly rooted in our technological leadership, which itself rests on a foundation of research and development. So in starting our work, the first questions we asked, how strong is the U.S. AI R&D environment, and how does it compare to the rest of the world? And what we found was that the U.S. is ahead, but our lead is a little shaky, both in terms of the pace and focus of adversaries, and also that our own innovation foundation for AI R&D is starting to show cracks. And what we mean by that is that the development of AI is concentrating in fewer organizations, in fewer geographic regions, and pursuing fewer pathways. And as a result, our national innovation environment rests on this narrowing foundation. And a lot of this comes down to resources. Progress on the cutting edge now often requires access to tremendous amounts of compute and training, which far surpasses the budgets that are available to universities and research organizations and small businesses. And we found that this high barrier to entry is effectively limiting the number of Americans able to shape the field and the future of AI. And it threatens U.S. competitiveness in AI in 4 key ways. It contributes to this brain drain from academia to industry, which weakens our ability to train the next generation of researchers and practitioners. It's exacerbating a well-documented lack of diversity in the field. It's skewing research towards areas that hold commercial promise, and it's limiting paths to growth for AI startups. So in the context of these cracks, we see a really key role for the federal government to reverse the trends we've identified through strategic direction and sustained resources.
So one of the things that you noted is related to compute and resources. And we wouldn't even be talking about AI today if it wasn't over the past 10 years we've seen AI innovation being driven and fueled data and better algorithms and large amounts of powerful computing. And the good news is the cost, per unit cost of cloud-based computing, it's been declining. And the availability of open source software and platforms, all that has lowered the barriers to core machine learning. While on the other hand, all this has enabled pursuit of sophisticated models that require extensive training data and a virtually insatiable demand for computing power. So the cost and the quantity, the volume of computing has gone up, but the appetite for computing has kept pace. And you've probably seen the study that plots this increase of demand for compute over a 5-year period. The study found that from 2012 to 2017, there was progressive release of more and more powerful and more complex deep learning AI models. And the trend line is really compelling, with the amount of compute required for these models doubling every 3 to 4 months with the release of the next model. And this is even before really large models came on the scene. And I'll give you an example. So in June of past year, OpenAI released its largest prediction and generation model called GPT-3. It's able to write coherent text with minimal human prompting, and it is composed of 175 billion parameters, and it costs $12 million in computing just to train it one time. And my final comment here is our commissioners are really concerned that the bar to being on the cutting edge of AI research is rapidly moving out of the reach of most researchers across the country. And soon only the well-endowed large universities and big tech companies are going to be able to advance the field of AI. So we think it's incumbent, the commission believes it's incumbent on the government to underwrite essential resources such as compute, and that researchers across the country can continue to contribute to AI innovation based on their ingenuity rather than on privileged access. And our commissioners want to create the conditions for a country filled with AI makers and explorers and no willing person left watching from the sideline.
That's where the state of AI R&D is in the private sector and academic sector vis-a-vis the U.S. government. But what about compared to China? Did you guys look at what China is doing in terms of providing compute for these massive models and that sort of thing? And are they ahead of the U.S. in that regard?
Yeah, so that was one of the guiding opening questions that we had of where the U.S. stands vis-a-vis other countries, notably China. And we found the U.S. still leads in cutting edge AI research, but the strength of that lead is pretty uncertain. It could be 1 year, it could be 5 years. And that's due in large part to this strategic focus from the Chinese government in terms of providing the resources and providing the push, trying to attract the best talent. We put that context in the report saying we can't rest on our laurels. We need to also invest in American innovation and lift up the strengths of the American AI R&D ecosystem so that we can widen that gap and really unlock the opportunities that are available.
The Commission's recommending big federal investments in AI R&D. As I remember from the report, they're recommending doubling non-defense R&D spending annually until it reaches $32 billion in 5 years. Can you talk about how increasing the investments would be accomplished and what impact the Commission hopes it'll have?
Absolutely. And good memory, you got the numbers right. We're recommending that Congress double non-defense AI R&D funding and then continue to double it until we reach that height of $32 billion fiscal year 2026. And we're pretty clear that this is expensive, but we see it as a really critical investment in America's future economy and national security. We're recommending this large amount to hope that additional funding can be used to strengthen basic and applied research, expand fellowship programs, and support that research infrastructure that we also recommend. And we really envision it as a holistic strengthening of AI R&D so that we can maintain focus on critical fundamental research that furthers the technology while also supporting mission-focused efforts, applying AI to new fields of study, being able to tackle those big societal level challenge problems, and then also support pipelines for transition of success. And the report, you'll see in the report, it calls out several agencies through which this amplified funding should flow. But we really see it as going across the board, but then particularly focusing through these agencies, namely the National Science Foundation, as well as the National Technology Foundation that we recommend, the Department of Energy, National Institutes of Health, National Institutes of Standards and Technology, and NASA. And I'll mention, Craig, in terms of the mechanics behind this, we see a really critical role for this new National AI Initiative Office that was established in last year's National Defense Authorization Act as an office within the executive branch within the Office of Science and Technology that can help steward and coordinate this amplified federal AI R&D funding across the agency so that it can be focused to advance priority areas of research while also support the associated priorities of fellowships and research infrastructure and the like. And we really think that if these recommendations are implemented, that they could dramatically expand the ability of Americans, regardless of background, geographic location, or field of study, to access AI and other emerging disruptive technologies. We really see it as a game changer for American innovation.
Can you talk about the rationale behind establishing a National Technology Foundation and exactly what that would be? I know there's a National Research Foundation.
It's a National Science Foundation.
National Science Foundation. I'm sorry. Yeah, there's already a National Science Foundation. Can you relate the two and talk about what the National Technology Foundation would do?
Sure thing. As we looked at the national AI environment, we assessed currently federal funding is much stronger on the research side of things, i.e. the science, rather than the development or the engineering side. And that the current federal R&D posture really lacks an entity that provides that level of investment, focus, and risk-taking that's warranted by the transformational benefits of technologies such as AI once they're out of the lab and in use. And so we've envisioned the NTF as providing that ability to drive technology progress at a national level by focusing on generating value at intermediate levels of technical maturity, prioritizing use-inspired technology concepts, establishing infrastructure for experimentation and testing, and supporting transition of successful outcomes. What this really comes down to is scope, scale, and culture. Accelerating technology development and demonstrating technology readiness is challenging, it's costly, it's risky, and it requires a diverse base of researchers and developers from both academia and the private sector. So our commissioners felt that an institution best poised to meet this mandate would be one that's purpose-built for it, namely structured to accept higher levels of risk, empowered to make big bets on innovative ideas and people, and focused on generating value at these intermediate levels of technical maturity. And we see this as a natural complement to the work of the National Science Foundation, as well as a partner for institutions such as DARPA, taking the advances that come from NSF-funded work and taking them a step further in terms of development and applying those to new challenge problems or new fields and experimenting. And we really see this NTF as a down payment on the future national ability to lead in AI and other disruptive technologies, and then continue to sustain that lead for generation.
And that's primarily a funding organization, or would it include physical labs or locations?
It would be primarily funding external research, but also funding infrastructure for that experimentation and testing.
And can you talk about the Commission's vision for a national AI R&D infrastructure? There's been a lot of talk about building up microelectronics pipeline onshore, and Mike was talking about making compute available. What's the sort of umbrella vision, and how do you see that being implemented?
That's a great question, Craig, and I'd be glad to take a crack at it. So, as you're describing here, this democratized access to computing environments and data and testing facilities, the things that are really necessary to drive AI innovation, these need to be in the hands of researchers and beyond leading industry players and elite universities, as we've been discussing. The ability for these researchers to be able to pursue cutting-edge AI. And we see this as a a key move to strengthen the foundation of American AI innovation by supporting more equitable growth, expanding AI expertise across the country and applying AI to a broader range of fields. And so there's a number of investments that the Commission recommends that the country invest in for infrastructure here. The first would be a national AI research resource, what we call the NAIR. And it's one of the strategic moves the government's actually in the process of taking to make the computing resources I talked about earlier available to researchers across the country. I'm really pleased to say that Congress, in the last National Defense Authorization Act, they kicked this off by directing a task force to develop an implementation plan. And they did so based off the recommendation our commissioners made in our first quarter recommendations submitted around a year ago. And so this NAIR will provide access to cloud-based computing resources, along with large-scale open training data, a set of domain-specific AI test beds, an open knowledge network, and probably even just as important would be support to the users of the resource, support and training. And so this funding from the government would support staffing and commercial cloud resources, which we envision to be augmented through public-private partnerships. And this supported staff would maintain and improve the architecture, work with the data, and create interfaces and tools and provide this support to the researchers. The next area of infrastructure investment that we recommend is to create a network of national AI test beds. And these test beds would be open to the academic, business, and government research communities, again, to drive basic research and applied research. And so they can address complex problems and develop AI systems ripe for commercialization. The test beds should support experimentation, which ties back to Tess's comments about the National Technology Foundation, the NTF. So this experimentation with, yes, novel software and hardware equipped with rich simulation capabilities to model the physical world. So, for example, a self-driving vehicle test ring, or an instrumented humanitarian aid and disaster relief test site, or, say, an instrumented home environment. So such resources would help establish and maintain benchmarking standards that enable measurable research progress and reproducible tests. And they should be used to collect valuable data that could be made accessible to the community, providing additional fuel for AI progress. And so we envision various federal agencies investing in AI test beds, and these would be aligned to the host agency's domain and mission priorities. And they would be set up as user facilities, supported, for example, through combinations of grants and user fees. So that's the test beds. Then a third area of investment would be something called the Open Knowledge Network. And the government should sponsor an open knowledge network that would serve verified US-based companies and researchers of all backgrounds to use world knowledge to develop their AI systems that operate effectively and efficiently. And so this would be a push to federate and map together existing specialized knowledge networks and add to it the ontologies and the data models that are part of government data platforms today, but also allow for the building and increasing of real-world knowledge and context over time. And this is something that we think would be well managed by the National Science Foundation, building on existing work that they have going on through their Convergence Accelerator. The fourth area of recommended investment, no surprise, is unlocking government data for AI research and development. This effort would responsibly create new pipelines for curating and hosting and maintaining data sets that, again, would set the foundation for future AI capabilities. Even more, it would help strategically steer the research community towards issues in the public interest and advanced technology around data set lifecycle maintenance. One such pipeline we recommend is for the Department of Energy to administer an AI data program that would create exemplar complex data sets and maintain them as living, regularly updated resources. And these could include specialized data sets in physical, biological, earth, and engineering sciences, as well as the social sciences. DOE would need to work closely with NIST to develop standards for the data, to include standards for documentation, data modeling, data engineering, and data formats, as well as to advance the methods and tools necessary to support this data lifecycle. There's a particular opportunity here to be had. And currently, there's a sizable amount of government data that it's legal to share with trusted non-government parties, but it's not being shared due to a lack of confidence, particularly confidence in the cybersecurity and privacy protecting technologies behind the data. And therefore, there's this lack of willingness to accept risk. And so we recommend the National Science Foundation establish a program where they would fund cybersecurity and privacy researchers to undertake rotational assignments at federal agencies, working closely with their data stewards, and apply these promising new methodologies for protecting the data, for preserving the privacy in a controlled manner. And this would provide a proving ground for these new approaches and, just as important, objective evidence to justify evolving the data sharing policies and practices, help raise the bar of confidence, and so that we can unlock holdings that the federal government has in terms of its data. We think this would responsibly unlock this access and stimulate more AI research and innovation.
Can you explain what you mean by world knowledge bases?
An open knowledge network, it is data about the data. And it allows you, therefore, to be able to build up knowledge bases, be able to start to support things like common sense reasoning, but it's data about the data. When we're talking about an open knowledge network, we're talking about rich descriptive data about objects that are part of our real world. And so these would be shared and common attributes that describe parts of our world. And you could imagine having this shared and common set of attributes lets you then explain and navigate and be able to reason in ways that just data alone doesn't let you accomplish.
When you were talking about data sharing, does that extend to sharing with our allies in both directions?
It does. It's certainly very important. And it's within the scope of this infrastructure. How we think about it is that there are different types of environments and platforms within this ecosystem, this infrastructure, that will allow then different types of users and contributors to participate and collaborate. International partners and allies is one. Within government, researchers is one. With industry researchers and supporting open academic research is another. And so there are different forms in which the infrastructure and these collaborative environments can be constructed, and they're needed. And our final report does point to creating a collaborative environment for research and AI innovation with our allies and like-minded countries.
The timeline for the spending is 5 years. How long do you think it would take to implement some of these other actions, the National Technology Foundation to get it active, the National AI R&D infrastructure, and some of the other things that you've talked about?
I can jump in here on the NTF, and then, Mike, I'll pass it back to you. Our vision for the NTF has a similar trajectory of 5 years, looking out 5 years as the research funding. And essentially, we want to see the funding grow to reach a height of this organization. We're recommending it be funded at $30 billion per year. And that's not just AI R&D funding. It would tackle a suite of 8 to 10 strategic technologies. So we see the first 2 years really working through the congressional authorization and appropriations process, getting up off the ground, amplifying funding as it becomes built out as an organization.
Yeah, and then To the part of your question around the infrastructure, and particularly this national AI research resource, as I mentioned, Congress has started a task force to study and create an implementation plan. We are recommending in our final report that Congress quickly take the next action to move to implementation. So take the plan and move with it. There are going to be areas of opportunity with creating this resource that can be done in the near term, say within a year, and create some basic capability, start to cultivate a community of use. And then over time, it could be enhanced to be able to tackle some of the more challenging types of data and being able to host test beds, community challenges. So this is something that can actually be built upon and gain momentum over time.
The other thing that I think would be helpful to highlight is the research priorities that we issued along with this amplified research funding. So I talked a lot about the numbers and the agencies it would go through, but we also put out with that recommendation these key areas of AI research that we think should be furthered by this funding. Mike, do you want to quickly run through those?
So Tess, as you mentioned, the commissioners, they have chosen to highlight a number of different areas for AI research. And some of these would fall under the category of like general frontiers of AI and AI in the future, as well as priority research areas for federal support. And these areas are being recommended either because the private sector may not invest in them or because they have particular importance and relevance to national security and defense. Now, I will say that in the final report, the lists of research areas that our commissioners provide, they are necessarily short. And so it was a very difficult decision for them as to where to draw the line. Nonetheless, looking to the future, the commission assesses that the frontiers of AI research will include human AI teaming, novel ways of learning, edge computing, advanced reasoning, and research towards more general AI. And then additional research areas, particularly important to national security and defense, are advanced scene understanding, autonomous AI systems, complex multi-agent scenarios, AI for modeling, simulation, and design, test and evaluation, robust and resilient AI, preserving privacy, and AI system risk assessment. And if you step back and look at these areas, they fall into several broad categories of first, working with humans. Then there's using AI for sensing and perceiving. Then there's using AI for learning and reasoning. Then there's integrating AI with assurance. And kind of a last category here of hardware, devices, and robotics.
Is your sense, after having worked on this, that if implemented, these recommendations will keep us well ahead of China in the R&D space?
I do. And I think I speak for the commissioners that they're pretty bullish on American innovation. And a lot of the underpinning goals of these recommendations are how we can democratize access. And like Mike said, really unlock that ingenuity that's here to begin to really realize the benefits of AI and applying it to all sorts of different fields and problems, and really inculcating, as one of our commissioners, Andrew Moore, likes to say, this maker culture by allowing people to experiment with AI and see what it can do. We feel that these resources will provide that access. And I'll just caveat that a lot of it is also tied to this question of talent as well. And you're familiar with our report's recommendations around talent and building up that base of digital talent within the U.S. through STEM education. So with many parts of our report, a lot of it is intertwined.
That's it for this week's podcast. I want to thank Tess and Mike for their time. I encourage everyone who cares about the future of our world to read the National Security Commission on AI report, which can be found at www.nscai.gov. Regardless of how you feel about military uses of AI, it's critical that people involved in the field understand what the government is doing. The singularity may not be near, but AI is changing your world, so pay attention.